Hi, so today we're going to be looking at compression. Now, compression is one of the hardest to understand things in mixing, in my experience. And it's one of the things that I think is often misunderstood and people struggle with it, really understanding it well. And we're going to look at it and really, I hope, really make it clear so you really understand exactly how it works and what you can do with it and what it can be used for. So specifically, we're going to be looking at the attack and release, because these are the key bits of really getting compression to work in many mixing situations. The attack, I think, is more known. People understand that you can use it to shape the attack of something, but we're going to look more closely at that and the different kinds of things that you can do with the attack. But the big one is the release control. In my experience, it's the hardest one to understand exactly what it's doing and what you can do with it. So we're going to be looking at that. The release control can be used, if used well, to color the sound, to change the tone of instruments quite profoundly. And we're going to see how that works and how you can use the release to, kind of like an EQ, although really different from an EQ, but in the same way that you can change the tone of something in EQ, you can change the tone of something by how you set the release. And we're going to look at how that works, demonstrate it so you can hear it. And we're going to be using the Vice compressor, because it's got a really great display where you can actually see what's happening with the release, and I think that makes it easier to kind of understand what's changing and match that up with what you're hearing. And it's also a compressor that has incredibly precise control, so we can really hone things in and demonstrate clearly the different kinds of things that you can do with release. So release can also be used to create groove, and we're going to look at how that works too. So I hope you're going to find this useful. But before we get started, if you can like the video and ring the bell and subscribe, that's really helpful to me. And if you can press the thanks button, that's really appreciated and really helps the channel keep going. So we're going to be using Snare because it's really a good one, I think, for really understanding and hearing what happens when you change the attack and the release. You can really going to hone in on understanding and hearing those differences. So starting with the attack, you probably know that the attack is used for creating punch and smack and impact and all that kind of thing. And I'm guessing you probably maybe understand, and if you don't, I'll explain it, that when you get a sound like a snare drum has a very strong attack to it called a transient, as you probably know. And that transient can be affected with the attack setting on a compressor. You can reduce that, so you can soften it, you can accentuate it, you can make it a lot louder. And you can, when you accentuate it, you can change the width of that attack, so that you can make it really spiky, you can make it smacky, and you can move it wider still and get it punchy and wider still and get what I call the kind of baseball or cricket bat, if you're English or British, snare sound. All those different changes in the character of the snare can be affected by moving the attack. And there's more, but that's the kind of basic idea of the attack. Now, the reason I use this compressor is a couple of reasons. One, it gives you incredible amount of control over every detail of how the compressor works. The only compressor I can think of that has this level of control is the Unison compressor by Tone Projects, which has in some ways even more control than this one. But this has an enormous amount of control. It has a lot of unique features unique to the device, and it sounds amazingly transparent and smooth, as does the Unison. But this one also has this display, and I think we're going to find this really useful to see as well as hear what the compressor is doing when we mess around with the different controls. Try and ignore all these controls here. This could be confusing. Just think of all three of these controls as being the release. In this compressor, you've got a lot more going on in terms of the control you can have over the release. But for our purposes, just think that this is the release. As I turn it up, it's making the release longer. As I turn it this way, it's making it faster. So just try to keep that in mind and ignore the extra knobs here. Ignore this one, we're not going to be using that one. And the attack is, as you'd expect it to be, the attack. Then we have the threshold and the ratio here. I've got this set pretty high because I want you to be able to hear what's going on here, like really easily. So I'm just going to bring this back to default here. And what we're going to do is we're going to be working with the attack to begin with. So we're going to listen to the snare first without any compression on it, just to see what that sounds like. There's a kick drum playing as well, just for context. But we're listening to and working with the snare. So I'm going to take this out. When that's yellow, it means it's out. When it's grey, it's engaged. So let's start with it out and listen to the snare. So not a bad snare sound. It's got some EQ on it, but that's the only other processing on it. You can hear some leak through of the cymbals and toms at times, but that doesn't matter. Okay, so we're going to start with the attack, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the attack faster and faster, and you'll hear that it starts to kill off the initial transient, the initial attack of the snare. And as you'll see on this here, you're going to see the grey part of this display is the snare itself, and the red is how this compressor is bringing the level down in response to that. So it's worth noting how that happens. That snare is triggering the compressor because that threshold has been set here and it's lower than the level of the snare. So as that snare crosses the threshold, it's going to trigger the compressor to bring that down, that level down. You'll see that come down as a red part of the graphic, and then once that snare is no longer crossing the threshold, which happens quite quickly because it's just a snare hit, that compressor is going to release that volume. The volume is going to come back up, and the rate at which it comes back up is of course controlled by the release control here, but you'll also see it on the graphic as the curve to the right hand side of each snare hit. The shape of that curve is going to represent how quickly the release happens and how quickly the level comes back up after it's been brought down. So I'm going to play this now, and I'm going to bring the attack faster and faster and listen to the attack transient portion of the snare as I do that. So you can hear at that point it's pretty much killed the attack entirely. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this up, and it's going to start letting through some of the attack. So I'm going to start by just getting a little bit of it to be allowed through and see what that sounds like. So now you can hear that a little bit of that attack is coming through. It's got a little bit of a spike, a little bit of a snap going on. And I'm going to make it a bit slower and see what that does. So now you can hear a bit more of the attack. It's a bit more of a kind of like spank sort of sound going on. So let's keep going up with this. Now you've got like pretty extreme sort of punch going on. I'm going to just back this off a little bit here where we were a minute ago, and I'm going to A-B it so you can hear what that sounds like. I'm going to bypass the compressor so you can hear what it's like original and then compressed. Start with it out. So a really, really different snare sound at this point. Much more spankier and much more compressed sounding. So let's move this a bit further and see what this does. So now you've got like a really lot of punch going on there. I think of this kind of sound as the kind of baseball bat or cricket bat, if you're English sound. It's really like because you're getting more of that attack. You're quite a bit of the attack of the snare, and a little bit of the body sound of the snare is now getting through that attack before the compressor grabs it. So what you're getting is an accentuation of that. I'm going to go back over to the graphic here. And just look at here, when we had the attack really fast, basically it was grabbing this immediately and pulling it down. As we made it a little bit slower, the very beginning part of this started getting through, and you got that kind of spiky sound, and then or sort of snappy sound, and as we made it a bit slower, still more of this got through, and you got more of a kind of spanky sound. And at this point, quite a bit, like this whole first part here, I'm guessing, roughly, is gotten through. And so you've got a real punch going on there. So let's keep going with that attack control. At this point you can see it's happening after the grey spike. So the grey spike represents the actual snare, remember, and the red is where the compressor is grabbing. And at this point you can actually see in the graphic it's coming quite a ways after that. It'd be quite nice if you could zoom in on this and see like really in detail, but you get some indication from this. So I'm going to keep going with this attack. Now at this point, you're pretty much not seeing any red appearing, and that is because the attack is so long that the entire snare has passed, or at least the proportion of the snare that's crossing the threshold has passed by before the compressor can grab it, because its attack is so long. So just back over to our little graphic here, like a lot more of this has passed through before that attack has happened. And so you're hearing the entire snare. Now if I bypass this, let's see if we even hear any difference. Very little, because it's basically not getting compressed. So that's the attack control. Now I'm going to bring this back up to midway, and then we're going to have a look at the release. The release is more complex, but we're really going to dig into that and understand it. And I hope by the end of this video, you're really going to understand really well what the release can do and how you work with it and how you understand it, how you understand setting it. So just as an overview, as I said, the release is the one that's maybe the hardest to hear and understand, because if you have a lot going on through the compressor, like a whole mix or an instrument that's doing a lot of changes, a vocal or any instrument that's playing a lot of different things, a guitar or a bass or anything like that, there's a lot changing as you're listening to it. Like everything's changing every second. You know, the notes are moving in pitch, they're moving in their texture, and the level. The attack is changing. Everything about it is kind of changing all the time. So it's quite hard to pin down what changes are happening when you're moving something like the release when you've got all those other changes happening at the same time. I think that's partly what makes it hard for people to hear. And also I think just not really quite understanding exactly what the release can do. When you understand the kinds of changes and effects it can have, it really helps to hone your ear on what you're listening to. So also the release, when it brings it up, it's like, depending on what part it comes up in, determines what part of the rest of the snare gets heard in relation to the loudness of the attack. So if you bring it up really quite quickly after the attack, you're going to hear that initial bit right after the snare transient, which is the kind of, in most snares, it's the snare wire, the kind of sandpapery high mid frequencies of the snare are going to get brought up. If you bring the attack release a little slower and it brings up later, you're going to be bringing up the mid tone of the snare, because snares tend to, the sound of a snare tends to move from, depending on the actual snare itself, from that initial sandpapery sound down to more of a ringy, down to the low end is the kind of later bit on most snares. So depending on how you move that release, you're going to be bringing up the ring, the sandpapery snare wire bit, or the ringy middle part of the snare, or the body beefy part of the snare, or maybe both of those things. So we'll see how that tone shaping happens. We'll look at that, demonstrate it, and see how that works. Now, this is where I think this display is going to help more, because as we play, I'm just going to play it for a second here. Now you see the right hand side, there's a curve there. It's straight on the left and curved on the right. The curve on the right is the release time. It's how fast it lets it come back up. If you imagine that this compressor is a bit like you turning a fader down very quickly as soon as the snare hits, it's how quickly you move that fader back up to where it was before the compression started. So this release part of the compression is probably the hardest bit to understand, but it's also the bit where there's a lot of creative potential here. And we're going to look at this. You can do a lot of different things with it. So I'm going to start moving this release in different directions and see what it does to the sound as I do that. I'm going to start with it really fast. If you notice when I've got it at this point here, it's bringing the volume up. Let's go back to a graphic again here, and you can hear the change in tone when I do that, and that is because it's bringing, the volume is being brought down as this crosses the threshold, and it's bringing the entire snare down, and then as the release happens, it's starting to bring the snare back up again. So the attack is already passed, and now we're looking at the next bit of the sound, which is the kind of snare wires, the kind of sandpapery bit after the attack. And the way we've got the release set right now, it's bringing it up right at that point. So you're hearing that snare wire sound amplified. So have a listen again. I'm going to make it faster, and then I'm going to slow it down and listen to that sandpapery snare wire part of the snare sound and how that changes. You hear that difference when I make it faster? You get that secondary part of the snare sound, the bit just after the transient that gives you that kind of upper mid high frequency snare wire sound gets louder, and as I make it slower, that is no longer heard as loudly, and that is because when it's slower, if we go back to our graphic here, if you imagine that this part is the kind of snare wire part, now with this release slower, it's not coming up until, say, this point, so that we're not really hearing that come up anymore. We're hearing a bit of the body of the snare come up now instead, because the body of the snare is going to happen around this area. That's what we're now hearing. So have a listen to the change. I'm going to move it back and forth again between fast enough to grab that bit of the snare wire and then a bit slower so that it then misses that bit and starts to get a bit of the body. So we'll start with it a bit faster. So you can hear that difference. And the other interesting thing is that because we now have a gap between the transient, where although the transient was allowed to come through, it still brought the rest of the snare down in level. We've got a gap now between that and when it starts to come back. And that gap in sound is making that transient sound more it's sounding more distinct. Whereas when we had the release a little faster and we were hearing that snare wire part, it was kind of attached to the transient. Now that we've got that gap there between the transient and when the level comes up a bit later on, as we're hearing now, it's making that transient more apparent. It's making it sound more snappy. So now let's move even a bit slower and see what happens with that release. So now it's even more separated from the attack when the release brings it up. But so it's making it sound even more snappy and smacky, but it's also starting to now grab the end of the snare where you've got the ringing part of the snare. So that's getting accentuated. And if we have a look now at this display, you'll also see that that line curve is it's a bit longer. It's a bit more of a curve now as it comes up. So have a look at that. You can see that curve is a bit wider now. So, and I'm going to bypass it again now, and I want you to listen to the body of the snare sound now compared to bypassed. So you can hear now by moving the attack even a bit slower, I've got the same sort of attack as the original, but I've now got quite a bit more body coming out because of that release being timed so that it brings up the end of that snare sound. I'm going to move it even a bit further now. So now you can hear it's bringing up more of the even later part where you've got more of that kind of low end of the snare happening. So this is giving it a lot more kind of solid, beefy kind of sound. So let's compare this now to the original unbypassed. So quite a difference. You're really getting a lot more tone out of it. Now keep in mind, I'm exaggerating all of this. More extreme than I probably would do it. I mean, you might do something this strong to a snare. You'd have to hear it in the context of the rest of the track. but I'm pushing it pretty hard so that you can hear it more obvious. So let's move a bit faster still with that release. Now you've got almost like a gunshot sound, because it's not coming up in time to hear any of the rest of the snare. So all you've got now is the attack. That might be quite a useful creative tool if you wanted that kind of a snare sound, or you wanted to add that into, you do it in parallel and add it into your snare sound. And you can really see that curve here. It's taking quite a long time to come back. Now if we go even further, let's see what happens. Now, it's not even getting up at all. It's not managing to get all the way up before it gets re-triggered again by the next snare. And what the effect of that is it's just like turning the volume down, because it's never able to return back up, so that by the time the next snare hits, it's not come up to full volume. So you're starting at a lower volume and you've basically turned the level down of the entire snare track. So that's a reason why you need to be careful about your release time, because you can just end up doing something like that. Now, long release times can be useful for other things, which I'm not going to cover in this video, but I might in another video, for mastering and things and leveling things out. It can be really useful. But in a situation like this, you can see what happens where it's basically, once it goes past the next snare hit, the time of the release, all you're doing is turning the snare down. Well, it's not all you're doing, but it's a big part of what's then going on at that stage. So bringing this back up, you can see how powerful that release is. It not only does it bring out different parts of the snare sound, but it also changes how the attack sounds because of that separation away from the attack portion. And in combination with moving this attack control, there's a huge amount of tonal variation. And this is just a snare. I mean, you can do this with any instrument, and it obviously works different on different instruments, but the concept here is that compressors are at least as much about shaping the tone as they are about controlling dynamics. As a tone shaper, they are a vital tool. They work really differently. You don't get the same results at all with an EQ. It's really, really different. So just to show you like how powerful a compressor is for tone shaping. And then of course there's the groove side of it. So how that comes up, the timing of that release, if you time that to the music, and if it's a drum or anything that's locked into a groove, how that moves up and how the decay of that instrument fits into the groove is really important. I mean, one of the things that was said to me decades ago to a friend of mine to me about guitar playing was, when you end the note is this really important. It's not just when you start the note, it's you're sustaining a note on the guitar or any instrument, like when exactly do you end that note? That's actually really important. The timing of the end of a note is something that's often neglected, but it can be used to great effect with groove. And this is exactly what we're talking about here, is you've got a sustain of a snare, and like if you're going to accentuate that and bring that out, like when does that end in relation to the other parts of the groove going on? And that's a kind of like, in a nutshell, how you create groove with a compressor. But of course, different instruments, it'll work slightly differently, but it's the same concept regardless of what instrument you're using. It's how does that, you're shaping the volume envelope of an instrument, how does that shape relate to the beat? So we're going to look at that and how you control that. I'm going to start with the snare, and I'm going to play with the release, because this is where the groove part comes in. It's all in the timing of the release. So I'm going to go to my trusty Music Math. This is a great little app. I think it's free. If it isn't, it's really cheap. And it's got a tap. You can tap the tempo. or type it in this case it's 100, and then it shows you lots of useful stuff. But what we're looking at here is that you can see that like a quarter note is 600 milliseconds at 100 BPM, and an eighth note is 300. And those are the two I'm going to be interested in. So I'm going to set my release at 300 and 600, because that means that it's going to be pulling down on that snare and bringing the body up of the snare. That's because this is how we've got it set, to bring the body of the snare louder. It's going to bring it up, and it's going to finish bringing it up right on the beat. And that can be used to create a groove. So I've set the attack and release up at, I can set it up at 600, close enough, don't have to be exact. And I want you to listen to the release, the body of the snare, and the feel of the kick drum and how they relate to each other. I'm going to bring it in and out so you can hear the difference with it not compressed and with it compressed. Move it up to 300. So to me, 300, which is an eighth note, really gives it a groove. When you bypass it and bring it in and out, just have a listen to that again. Listen to the feel of the kick drum. It's not like the release of the snare sound, the envelope of the snare sound, that like the end tone of it ends exactly on every kick drum hit, but it ends on a part of the beat, an eighth note, where it's locked into the groove. So you're getting the snare hit, and then you're getting the end of the snare ending on an eighth note. And that locks into the groove of the kick drum. So I'm going to, again, listen to it with and without. I'm going to bypass it and bring it back in. And listen to the difference in the feel and the momentum that it creates in the music. Start with it out. Do you hear how it gives momentum to the kick drum, and it just makes the groove a lot more momentum driven and locked? So, and this is just a snare, and this is just using the release of the snare tone, which is, not a lot to work with, but it still works. It still creates a groove. And you can imagine that if you're doing this with other instruments that had more sustain, where, you could time that release to a longer period of time, you can really do a lot in terms of the rhythmic feel and groove using a compressor. So you can use that technique on the entire mix. You can use it on just groups, or on the drum bus, or just single instruments like this drum, or any instrument. So that's one of the other major things that compressors are great for, and that is working with a groove and feel. So now we're going to look at one other thing that is a kind of main concept of how compressors are used, which is not necessarily easy to understand how to use it and what it can be good for, and that is parallel compression. So parallel compression is an incredibly useful tool for lots of different reasons, but we're going to take an example here that I hope is going to make it really kind of clear what it can do and the kind of thing it does do. I mean, you can use it for more than one thing, but the main thing you use it for is to bring up low-level information, the details that you otherwise don't hear very well. And so we're going to have a look at that with this snare. Now, I've chosen this snare because it's got a lot of ghost notes in it. I'm going to start with a bypassed and just let you hear the ghost notes for a second, meaning the little quieter hits between the main snare hits. Just listen to how easy they are to hear, and then we're going to try and bring those up, where I'm going to show you how effective it is to make those louder in comparison to the rest of the snare without affecting the loud hits. This is the key to parallel compression. It allows you to bring up those quieter parts without affecting the louder parts, without them getting compressed. Okay, let's have a listen to it with nothing. You could hear there was a little quiet taps in between the main hits, and those are the ones we want to make louder. Because although you can just about hear them now, by the time the mix is in there, you can't hear them at all. And we want to be able to hear those. This kind of music, those little details are absolutely vital to the whole feel of the music and the momentum of the music and lots of other things. So we really need to be able to hear them. So I'm going to now bring this in. Now I'm going to show you what settings I've got, what sound I've got before we make it parallel. So I've taken the parallel out of this, and we're just going to listen to what it sounds like not parallel, so you can hear what we've got. So you can hear what I've got is a very fast attack, so it's killing the attack completely. Now, why do I want to do that? Because I'm going to put it in with the original snare. I'm going to parallel it, meaning I'm going to have the original snare and this playing at the same time and mix between the two. Now, I don't want to double the attack up. Why? Because that's going to make the attack twice as loud. So what I'm trying to do is bring up the background information. So I don't want to make the attack any louder. That's why I kill it off in the parallel, so that I don't make it any louder. And the original attack is coming from the original snare and not being added to by this parallel change. So kill the attack, and now I've set the release time, and I might need to adjust this a bit, so that yes, it is bringing up a bit of the body of the snare, but mainly it's just allowing those quieter notes to sit there unaffected. So set the threshold so that those quiet ghost notes aren't really triggering the compressor too much. So it's killing the attack and then allowing those quieter snare hits to sit there fairly well unaffected. And the release is coming up fast enough so that it has released its compression and allowed the level to come up in time for those ghost notes to come through. So it's grabbing that snare and the loud hits, pulling it right down, but letting it come up in time for the ghost notes to be heard. So I'm going to listen to that again and listen to it from that perspective. You see how it's coming up fast, just fast enough for those ghost notes so that they don't get pulled, they aren't like being affected by the compression. Okay, so now I'm going to start to mix it in and go to parallel mode here. And this one, on this compressor, when you press parallel, what it does is it changes this knob from a makeup gain to a parallel wet dry mix. So that's why I've suddenly turned it down here, because I pressed the parallel button and it's now wet dry. So now I'm going to hear the dry sound now with this all the way down. And as I bring it up, I'm going to be bringing in that compressed sound that we were listening to just before this. So have a listen to now the original sound and how this is going to bring those ghost notes louder. So now you can hear how they're louder, but I'm going to bypass it now so you can really hear the difference. So now those ghost notes are really nice and loud. You can hear them really clearly. Without it, you can hardly hear them. But you've still got the same transient, the same big snare hits have been unaffected. And this is can be a little bit maybe tricky to grasp, but just remember the reason that they're not affected, it's in parallel, and I've killed off those attacks in the parallel chain. so that you don't get a doubling of them, so that basically you're just hearing the dry snare at that point because it's been killed in the compressed signal. So that's why we do it that way. So this is how one example of how parallel compression can be used. But the same principle could be used for anything where you want to hear that low-level material more. Even on a whole mix, it's quite a common thing to use on a whole mix in mastering. If you want to, the low-level information is not really easy enough to hear. You can bring it up by just, you wouldn't do it to this extremeness, but just very subtly bringing in a parallel compression chain can sometimes fix that problem. And it can be used in many different mixing contexts. So I hope that made that clear. And it's not the only way of using parallel compression. I'm just explaining that this is like one of the kind of primary ways that it's often used. And hopefully you can understand like some of the concepts there well enough that you can then kind of use it for your own purposes. So I hope you found this useful. If you did, please do give the video a like and subscribe and ring the bell. And if you want to press the thanks button, that really supports this channel and is really appreciated. And I hope to see you next time.